But without any further ado, we're already at 180 participants, which is absolutely fantastic. It's my sincere delight and pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening. Dr. Sylvain Cordier is the Paul Mellon Curator and Head of the Department of European Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. Born and raised in Paris, France, he received his PhD in art history from the Paris-Sorbonne University in 2009 with a dissertation on the Bélanger family cabinet makers in the 19th century. He began as an assistant curator at the Château de Versailles before becoming a lecturer in 18th and 19th century French art at the Paris-Sorbonne University. After completing his PhD, he spent some time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at the Getty Research Institute. Cordier joined the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts as curator of early decorative arts in 2013, and he stayed there for over 6 years. In Montreal, he curated the critically acclaimed international exhibition, Napoleon, the Imperial Household, which of course toured in Montreal, to the US and to France in 2018 and 2019. And this evening, or this afternoon for Sylvain, he's joining us to talk about the Trésors de Diplomatie, Sèvres, and the policy of gift giving of Napoleon's imperial household. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you also Felix and Sophie for this opportunity to talk to you, and good afternoon everyone, or good evening depending where you are right now on the globe. I'm very happy about this opportunity to speak with you all today about a subject I particularly like concerning French porcelain. The policy of gift giving during Napoleon's reign is a subject that I got particularly interested by during the presentation of the exhibition on the imperial household, which was presented, as Caroline was saying, 2 years ago, first in Montreal, then at VMFA, then at the Nelson Atkins, and eventually at the Château de Fontainebleau in France. There lies some of the most crucial elements concerning Napoleon's relation to art and diplomacy, centered around a golden age of the porcelain production in France under the direction of someone I hope, and I think everyone in this society appreciates, Alexandre Brongniart. The subject of imperial gifts is actually immense. Within the subject of the study of the imperial household, the subject of imperial gifts is quite an immense one. And I'm going to focus my talk specifically on Sèvres porcelain, leaving apart Gobelin tapestries, jewelry and gold boxes, paintings and sculptures, which are, however, interesting aspects regarding gift givings as well. But you know, I wouldn't have all the time in the world to talk about that. But within that, Sèvres gifts by themselves remain a huge topic, given the intense rhythm of production of the manufacture at the time under Napoleon's reign and Brongniart's leadership. So what I'm proposing today can only be a survey, a modest survey, to highlight some of the pieces that I find particularly relevant and focus on lesser known objects than the very famous ones, as well as some of the main criterias and contexts for this diplomatic, Napoleonic gift-giving policies. The first occasion that Napoleon had to use Sèvres for official diplomatic gifts actually predates his coronation as emperor. It happened during the consulate regime, so the first regime that granted Napoleon Bonaparte power as first consul of the French Republic, so between 1799 and 1804, before he could crown himself as Emperor of France. And that first opportunity is for diplomatic gifts of Sèvres dates from 1801, while Consul Bonaparte sought to affirm French influence over Italy against the Austrians, so as a consequence of the second campaign of Italy. Bonaparte imposed the creation of a puppet kingdom in Tuscany, which he named the Kingdom of Etruria, and he entrusted the crown to a particularly uncharismatic prince coming from the Bourbon Parma family, Louis, Count of Livorno. And Louis traveled to Paris, was received officially in order to receive his crown from the hands of the first consul and the French government. So not a particularly prestigious diplomatic encounter, but symbolically a very significant moment that revealed the coming back of France as an influential European power and a kingmaker about a decade after the beginning of the French Revolution, with Consul Bonaparte clearly staging himself as an equal to any other imperial sovereign of Europe able to make kings. So it's towards Sèvres that Bonaparte turns in order to establish the list of official gifts that France would present to this new king of Etruria. Although at the time, the Manufacture de Sèvres had not yet recovered from the considerable problems that it had faced during the revolutionary decade, nothing prestigious could be made on time for this royal or future royal visit. So decision was made to select old pieces that had remained by miracle in the collection of the Republican government or in the storage at the Manufacture since the early 1790s, 1792, 93, and the collapse of Louis XVI, the collapse of the Bourbon Ancien Régime monarchy. And these pieces that were found and gifted to the King of Etruria are nowadays still conserved in Italy in several public collections. The first piece was a spectacular, monumental, very large, as you can see, Medici vase made in the mid-1780s, actually completed in 1784, so very Louis XVI, and decorated by bronzes by Thomire, which you can still see today at the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. It was associated to a set of biscuit plaques forming a large round table plaque that had been completed during the revolution, completed in 1792 and mounted in 1801 for the occasion by Lignereux on a guéridon table. And these two were presented along with a dessert service that had begun being produced in Sèvres in 1792-93 when the Bourbon monarchy collapsed, and had continued being produced over the decade that was so complicated for Sèvres, which corresponds to the revolutionary period. We understand here that this Louis XVI selection is the result of a pragmatic selection of what was available at Sèvres at the time, but there's also an interesting ideological element to it. By selecting pre-revolutionary pieces, Bonaparte affirmed a diplomatic statement for a renewed, non-revolutionary minded foreign policy under his new leadership, a renewed policy that would refer back to some Ancien Régime visions and principles. And these Sèvres pieces offered to the King of Etruria obviously played their part in the future emperor's decision to involve Sèvres as much as possible in his policy of gift giving, to renew with a 18th century royal diplomatic tradition coming from Louis XV and Louis XVI, and to participate also in a general goal to restart a luxury production of state-sponsored porcelain that had been almost interrupted by the revolution. After the installation of the empire in 1804, an etiquette of the imperial court took some time to be established and redacted, and it was actually published for the first time in 1806. The matter of gift giving is addressed in the text. It stipulates that the responsibility for the presents made by the imperial household in the name of the emperor was going to the services of the Grand Chamberlain, and I quote, so the Grand Chamberlain takes His Majesty's orders for the presents His Majesty wishes to give to crowned heads, princes, ambassadors, and others to be paid for out of the privy purse. He had them made, settles on the prices, and orders the payments as he does for all the objects submitted for his personal inspection. During the first years of the empire, the Prince de Talleyrand was a Grand Chamberlain of the imperial household, but he also had the functions of Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we understand that this responsibility of diplomatic gifts falling upon him as a Grand Chamberlain of the household also made sense, given the fact that he was in charge of the emperor's diplomacy. But the Grand Chamberlain worked in that regard in close collaboration with two other senior members of the household. First, the Intendant Général, the General Intendant of the household, the Comte d'Aru, who oversaw basically all budgets concerning the functioning of the household, as well as the Général Duroc, the Grand Marshal of the Palace, for the management of presenting the gifts within the precinct of imperial palaces. And of course, this business implied a close collaboration with the directors of the imperial manufacturers involved, meaning for Sèvres, Alexandre Brognard. The director of the Sèvres manufacture played, in fact, a crucial role in fashioning the shapes, typology, decorative meaning of the different presents commissioned by the household to be offered as gifts. One principle in that regard is absolutely essential, and which I think we all want to keep in mind when thinking about gift giving, is the concept of grouping, so lot in French. Diplomatic gifts, court gifts, family gifts were conceived as groups of items, the variety of which depended on the importance of the receiver. Therefore, defining the impact of official gifts becomes a matter of arrangement and of clever, thoughtful, and impressive sense of composition. First of all, and we see here the purpose of the porcelain manufacturer director who in the end wants to sell his production as much, if not more, than the court logic. The idea of composing those gifts was to display and illustrate for each receiver a diversity and a complementarity of shapes and types of decoration, showing the wide range of artistic possibilities developed at Sèvres by the painters and decorators. A fair repetition between purely decorative items and more practical ones was also considered. For instance, you would find in a lot, in a grouping, vases of different sizes, but you also would find often a tea set, as well as in the most prestigious cases, full dessert services that would bring to foreign courts some of the dining habits of France, connecting again imperial France with an 18th century tradition on that regard, to export the dining habits of the court of France to other courts of Europe. And of course, and obviously, ideological and political propaganda was absolutely essential as far as decors were concerned. For instance, the presence of portraits in whatever form or unpainted decorations. Quite often, groupings involved the presence of a biscuit bust of the imperial couple or a painted portrait of Napoleon. I'm also talking about allegorical or historical representations promoting Napoleon's politics and deeds. In the vast majority of cases, gifts were made in a context of affirmation of imperial power, as we can imagine. For instance, a grouping that was made for the King of Saxony, Frederick August I, in 1809, unfortunately not localized anymore. So the Saxon elector turned into a king by Napoleon as a consequence of the Battle of Austerlitz, and a new king fully submitted to France's influence at the time. Well, in 1809, the Saxon king receives a grouping, including a pair of vases glorifying Napoleon himself through contemporary history painting, with two painting vases decorated with two painting tableaus showing on the one hand the emperor saluting the wounded on the battlefield, after the battle, sorry, and on another vases, the emperor visiting a field hospital, so perfect propagandist compositions. But that pair of vases was associated with another pair of vases decorated this time, interestingly decorated this time, with history tableaus celebrating this time the history of antique Macedonia, with a scene showing on the one hand the entrance of Alexander the Great into Babylon, and on the other vase, the triumph of the Roman general Paulus Aemilius after Macedonia's conquest by Rome, which was an interesting set of comparative scenes showing the glory and fall of a small kingdom like Macedonia that can always end up, if not behaving properly, end up crushed up by a more powerful empire. And so we understand that there's kind of a very bully way on the part of Napoleon to make expensive gifts to foreign vassals, if I can call the King of Saxony a vassal of Napoleon. The selection of decors could also reveal Alexandre Brognard's attention to reflect the hierarchy of genres in art, and especially in painting, or rather the variety of genre admitted at the time at the painting salon at the Louvre. And there that's particularly interesting because we see a fascinating parallelism and the part played by Imperial Sèvres in the ongoing debate in favor of porcelain as a legitimate rival to painting and sculpture, fine arts, at the time in the mind of a man like the director Alexandre Brognard. For instance, the fascinating group of vases, which I virtually recreate on this page, that was presented to Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother and King of Westphalia, on the occasion of the christening of the King of Rome in 1811. When you look at those 5 vases that were presented together to Jérôme, you see the conjugation, the association of 3 of the main genres that people could appreciate at the Salon of, say, 1810 and 1812. First, imperial portraiture, with this vase fuseau with the portrait of the emperor, nowadays conserved at the Château de Compiègne, associated with neoclassical history painting, kind of David-like history scenes, with this amazing scenes represented at those vases, Etrusca rouleaux, representing one scene, the departure for army, and the other scene, the return from the army by Georget, a pair, absolutely wonderful pair, conserved at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And the third, no less fascinating pair of vases, this time Medici vases, kind of echoing or representing landscape painting and genre scenes, with these views of the surroundings of Saint-Cloud, represented by Jean-François Robert, and the pair is now conserved at the Met. And I have to say that it was for me a great pleasure on the occasion of the organizing the exhibition, the Imperial Household, to be able to gather together, thanks to Compiègne and thanks to Hartford, to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, those 3 vases that hadn't been together for like generations, and to notice how fantastically they were dialoguing in the exhibition. Unfortunately, the Met was not able to lend their its pair of Medici vases, but it was still quite fascinating to be able to count on those 3 vases together. In composing the lots, the groupings, the question of the value of each piece was also important and reflected people's position within the hierarchy of honors from a diplomatical or a court perspective. For instance, a pair of vases that I particularly like members of the department of the Grand Master of Ceremonies of the imperial household were gratified in 1806 with Sèvres gifts following their role in organizing the wedding of Princess Stéphanie de Beauharnais with the Grand Duke of Baden, kind of the first political wedding, that marriage that Napoleon negotiated with a German prince for a member of his family. So the ceremony was of great political impact, and the service of the Grand Master of Ceremonies had to be rewarded for their participation. And the Grand Master of Ceremony received that amazing pair of Medici vases decorated with exquisite trompe-l'œil scenes painted by Sauvage, representing the crowning of Emperor Napoleon and Empress Josephine. And interestingly enough, we know the present that one of his junior associates, the Baron de Cramayel, Master of Ceremonies, received exactly in the same context. And it's quite interesting to notice that the vases are actually exactly the same shape, same size as well, but with a much simpler, and we understand much cheaper decoration than the very costly trompe-l'œil entrusted with a famous painter as Sauvage. But here we see for Cramayel this very simple trophy gilded decoration, obviously much cheaper than what his boss received at the same time. Circumstances, of course, varied in the motivation to present gifts. And as far as Sèvres pieces are concerned, I selected here 3 particularly important categories that matters during the reign of Napoleon. The first one was concerned dynastic ceremonial gifts. The second would be clearly diplomatic presents. And the third one would be New Year's Day court gifts. And I'll begin with diplomatic presents. The affirmation of the Bonaparte family's legitimacy on the French throne was an obsession for Napoleon, and we can understand why. And he ensured an ambitious matrimonial politics and diplomacy, especially concerning Italy and Germany, and the German sphere. Weddings and christenings of members of the clan became opportunities to display magnificence and, of course, political and personal gifts to important guests and courtiers involved in their preparation or invited to attend. And I've opted here on to present some gifts, some presents gifted on the occasion of what I think was the most spectacular and probably the most important of these dynastic ceremonies. That was the christening of the King of Rome, so Napoleon and Marie-Louise's son and heir to the imperial throne, that was organized on June 10th, 1811 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. An event which was supposed to seal the legitimacy of the Bonapartes, as well as a permanent diplomatic alliance between the side of the father, so Imperial France, and the side of the mother, Imperial Austria. Now let's have a look at what the imperial household presented to the child's godparents. The godfather of the King of Rome was Ferdinand of Habsburg-Lorraine, brother of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, and thus the great uncle of the baby. An interesting character, actually, Ferdinand of Habsburg-Lorraine, because he was probably the foreign prince who received the biggest number of presents from Napoleon over the course of Napoleon's reign, and at the same time, and very likely consecutively, at the same time was probably the European prince who lost the most as a result of Napoleon's politics of territorial expansion, first in Italy and then in the German area. At the time of the event in 1811, he was Grand Duke of Würzburg after having been chased away from his Grand Dukedom of Tuscany. So Ferdinand, as godfather to the King of Rome, received a splendid, absolutely splendid grouping of Sèvres, which luckily is still conserved intact at the Pitti Palace in Florence. not presented together, I don't think so, but at least the Pitti Palace keeps together the entire collection. It began with portraits of the imperial couple, a plaque by Georget for Napoleon, painted plaque, quite monumental, and a biscuit bust for Marie-Louise. Along with a absolutely spectacular ensemble of vases composed, and again, I tried a virtual recomposition of the set together, composed first of a large egg vase celebrating the child's birth, painted by Coupin de la Couperie, a monumental, absolutely monumental, 140 centimeters high Medici vase decorated with ormolu elements by Thomire, associated with some of my favorite Sèvres pieces ever, this pair of Medici vases decorated with scenes taken, inspired from Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign, painted by Swebach. On one vase, view of the hill of Jebeleyen, and on the other one, a view of the temple of Hermopolis. And I think those vases are particularly fantastic, especially when you look at that frieze decoration involving hieroglyphic ornaments, like treated as ornaments in the gilding. And you remember that we are in 1811, so only years from the moment that Champollion eventually managed to decipher hieroglyphic language and scriptures. Absolutely spectacular pair of vases, and along with a simpler but very nice as well, pair of Cordelier vases with flower decorations by Gilbert Drouet, the famous, one of the most important flower painter at Sèvres at the time. The King of Rome had two godmothers, including his grandmother, the Napoleon's mother, the famous and rather creepy Madame Mère. Her Sèvres grouping, the Sèvres grouping that she received for her presence at the christening, included a biscuit bust of her son, not actually this one, which in fact is a bust conserved at Compiègne, but after the same model as this one. So the model produced at the Manufactory of Sèvres after Chaudet's bust. She received also a rather famous vase, the vase Fuseau, now conserved at the Louvre, decorated by Georget, by a copy of the famous Bonaparte crossing the Alps by David, along with a large Etruscan vase, not this one, a large Etruscan vase with flower decorations by Drouet, a teacup ornate with Empress Marie-Louise's portrait by Leguet, and the vase that I'm showing you now, which in fact belongs to a pair, and unfortunately I only have this black and white photo of only one of them, Clodion vases dating from 1810, painted by Drolling, with two scenes of public celebrations in Paris. Here you see the Place du Palais Bourbon, so in French of what is today the National Assembly in France. So public celebration in Paris of the Treaty of Vienna, the treaty that established peace between France and Austria in 1809, and whose direct consequence was Napoleon and Marie-Louise's wedding, and therefore the birth of the King of Rome. So an interesting iconography of the Paris people rejoicing at the declaration of the peace. And the pair of these Clodion vases is today conserved in a private collection in Rome. The King of Rome's grandfather, on the maternal side, so Emperor Francis I of Austria, another creepy looking person, was also celebrated by a Sèvres grouping, a Sèvres lot. He did not attend the christening, but of course the grouping was sent to Vienna in honor of the Habsburg family. And the Sèvres grouping included a lavish dessert service, of which unfortunately so far, I think only 2 ice pails survive today, and they're conserved at the British Museum in London, decorated with views of the Imperial French's residence, the Palace of the Tuileries on one vase, and the Palace of Saint-Cloud on the other, as well as other representations of palaces on the other side, but the 2 most important being the Tuileries and Saint-Cloud. Napoleon's politics of gift-giving was also highly conditioned by the imperial expansionism on the eastern part of Europe, and in particular, the Germanic areas of Eastern Europe. So campaigning, defeating, creating alliances, breaking alliances, negotiating family unions, establishing puppet kingdoms that he would distribute to his siblings, also reducing German princes to vassality, etc., were as many opportunities to give away tokens of apparent friendship or considerations, always flavored with a certain sense of imperial supremacy. Among the many known examples of diplomatic Sèvres presence, I chose 2 cases, and again, there would be dozens and dozens of possibilities, but due to time limit, I chose 2 cases to discuss, which I find particularly interesting and illustrative. The first one dates from 1807. In 1807, following the tragic tragic for Prussia, Prussian defeat of Jena against the French, the court of Berlin sent Prince William of Hohenzollern, so the younger brother of King Frederick William III, to Paris in order to negotiate as much as he could a reduction of the war levy imposed by Napoleon to his country of Prussia. The diplomatic mission kind of failed, mostly failed, but Napoleon appreciated the man, and he commanded that a present would be prepared for him. And the present concerned a grouping of Gobelin tapestries, and unfortunately I couldn't really develop on Gobelin tapestries, but I'm going to do it for this particular case. So a lot of Gobelin tapestries that included quite an interesting iconography, I think, which was a Gobelin copy of a painting by Suvet dating from the 1780s, so before the revolution, representing Admiral Coligny impressing his murderer. So a kind of a reimagination of a scene coming from the 16th century wars of religion in France, celebrating particularly a historical figure of French Protestantism that was conceived, we understand, as a homage to the Prince of Prussia's faith on the part of France's Catholic court, imperial court. And that tapestry is no longer, we don't know if it still exists, but I'm showing you here the painting by Suvet and a copy, another version of turned into a Gobelin tapestries, which is conserved at the Royal Palace nowadays in Naples. Along with the tapestry went, of course, a Sèvres grouping, strikingly rich and diverse in decoration, involving 2 Clodion vases painted with figures by Drolling, unfortunately not localized anymore, and 2 Etruscan vases à l'armier, decorated with scenes inspired by the Bonaparte Egyptian campaign, painted by Bergeret, treated in an extraordinary manner, inspired by archaeology and Greco-Etruscan pottery. And one of these vases resurfaced 5 years ago and was acquired very cleverly by the Musée Napoléon Ier in Fontainebleau. And what you see here, of course, are the 2 sides of the same vase, 2 scenes on the sides. First, a modern but stylized representation of the pest in Jaffa. So of course, inspired by the famous propaganda painting of the scene made by Gros and conserved at the Louvre nowadays, painted in 1804. And on the other side of the vase, on the other face of the vase, an archaic style allegorical representation of Napoleon sort of as a semigod in heroic nudity, healing a man under the protection and under the supervision, if I may say so, of the god of health, Asclepius. So quite a fascinating, again, iconography and stylistic treatment of a propagandistic scene. These vases are associated with a marvelous, absolutely marvelous tea set, decorated, chocolate and tea set actually, decorated by Caron, with scenes taken from the fables of La Fontaine, a set that today is conserved at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And again, the exhibition in 2018-2019 gave us an opportunity to gather together the vase, the Fontainebleau vase, and the Minneapolis set, which from my perspective as a curator was a very moving moment. And I wanted to evoke that gift because also I recently came across an interesting watercolor by, you have here another, some other views of elements of that Minneapolis tea set presented to the Prince of Prussia. I wanted to evoke that gift because I recently came across that interesting watercolor made by Carl Beckmann and dating from the 1840s, showing Prince William of Prussia's drawing room at the Royal Castle of Palace of Berlin, and dating from the 40s, so from the end of his life. And you see not only what I think is clearly the Suvet tapestry. I really don't think it's the painting, but it looks like the tapestry, probably the tapestry whose borders, which must have been very Napoleonic looking, might have been removed after the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire. So you recognize the gift here. And again, we're at the end of the prince's life, so it's something that he kept all his life long. And you probably recognize also the pair of vases à l'armier, one of which was acquired by Fontainebleau recently. So an interesting example of the surviving of these Napoleonic diplomatic gifts way after the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire and the collapse of this generally detested bully emperor that went with it. The other example of diplomatic gift that I wanted to evoke here is a wonderful service, a piece of which I had the opportunity to acquire 4 years ago for the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, thanks to Camille Le Prince. I mean, if Camille is listening, hi Camille, and thank you very much for that. It's this ice pail, one of the few remaining pieces from the dessert service Marly d'Or with cameo-style heads, which was a service that was in the making apparently, and apparently was spotted by the King of Württemberg at Sèvres, so Frederick I of Württemberg at Sèvres. Frederick I was one of Napoleon's closest allies in Germany at the time, and he spotted the service in production during a visit that he paid to the manufacturer as a guest of France in December 1809. And this service apparently was intended for use of the French court by Napoleon himself, but it was eventually decided by the household in accordance with Napoleon that it would be of better employ as a token of friendship to the allied king of Württemberg. A few plates survive of that set, but most of it is lost and probably destroyed over the course of the 20th century and probably during the Second World War. All were decorated, so the plates were decorated with cameo profiles of Greek heroes, Greek and gods and goddesses here from the Greek mythology, while the pièces de forme had full-bodied figures. And on the Montreal ice pail, Mercury on the one side and Perseus on the other side. And for the record, I acquired that piece for Montreal in 2016, I think, because we were looking for an opportunity to make an acquisition in honor of Ben Weider, who was the big benefactor of Montreal, giving to the museum his collection of Napoleonic art and object. And we wanted to celebrate the decade of this donation. And so I was looking for an object. And Ben Weider had made his fortune in the industry of bodybuilding. And so when I saw that ice pail, thanks to Camille, I felt like this probably was the perfect, given the iconography, the perfect opportunity to make a present, to make an acquisition in honor, in homage to Ben Weider. Finally, I will conclude on the third context and categories of gift giving by the household in the form of New Year's Day presents. Celebration from New Year's Day was also a good way for the imperial couple to express marks of their favor, mostly to courtiers and members of the family. We have very few information about the kinds of gifts provided at court during the first years of the reign, so between 1804 and 1809, which corresponds to the moment when Empress Josephine is empress. But we know very well how things were organized after Napoleon decided to make it an official court tradition in provision, sometimes in 1810, in provision of January 1st, 1811, which corresponded to the first New Year's Day spent in France by his second wife, Empress Marie-Louise, whom he had married in April 1810. Correspondence between the Grand Marshal of the palace and the General Intendant of the imperial household is very informative of the management and protocol for that day, this protocol of the New Year Day. And I quote, His Majesty wishes, so it's the Intendant Général talking to the Grand Marshal of the palace, His Majesty wishes to make a few gifts on this occasion to the princesses of his family, like he did last year. He charged me to have you select the objects in question in the imperial manufactures of Sèvres, Gobelins, and Savonnerie, such as vases, teacups, portraits, small tapestries, etc. The concierge of the Tuileries Palace will have them all gathered in an apartment of the palace before sending them into His Majesty's bedchamber for the emperor to make his decision. It is necessary for each item to bear mention of its value. The ceremony implied for the empress, according to Napoleon's will, for the empress to be the distributor of the gifts, and only women of the imperial family and ladies in waiting were concerned at first. But it was the emperor who decided what would go to whom. After 1811, the list of people concerned extended to wives of distinguished courtiers and marshals, and also to one man, the Grand Chamberlain of the imperial household, Cardinal Fesch, who at the same time was Napoleon's uncle, the half-brother of his mother, Madame Mère. This New Year tradition lasted until the collapse of the regime in 1814. So there were 4 occurrences, of which a certain number, a fascinating number of objects are still known today. Most of them you will see being tea sets. Only one is known for New Year's Day of 1811. It's a vase fuseau with Napoleon's portrait, which was presented to Napoleon's sister, Caroline Murat, Queen of Naples, still conserved nowadays at Capodimonte. For 1812, we have more elements, and I'm showing you only a selection of those. Madame Mère, Napoleon's mother, receives a splendid tea set decorated with imperial hunting scene, conserved in a British private collection, painted by Jean-François Robert. Cardinal Fesch, so the Grand Chaplain I was mentioning earlier, received a no less splendid tea set decorated with flowers and insects by Gilbert Drouet on a chrome green, absolutely fantastic vermiculé ground, an object I'm particularly fond of because it happens to be my first acquisition as curator at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts when I arrived there in 2013. And in 1812, in January 1812, for less senior members of the imperial court, we see smaller decoration, very nice, but smaller in size. Here we have a wonderful pair of vases which were presented to the wife of Napoleon's cavalry general of the Imperial Guard, the Duchess of Istria, conserved in the French private collection. And next to it, you see a broth bowl decorated with racing scenes which was presented to one of the ladies in waiting to Empress Marie-Louise, the Countess of Montalivet, which also was acquired not so long ago by the Château de Fontainebleau. 1813, New Year's Day of 1813, we see again Madame Mère receiving that year, a particularly spectacular tea set with portraits of members of the imperial family. Napoleon, so we're in 1813, so Napoleon and the King of Rome are represented on each side of the teapot, whereas the teacups, milk jug, and sugar bowl are ornate with portraits of Napoleon's sisters and sisters-in-law. Again, a recent acquisition of the Musée Napoléon Ier in Fontainebleau, coming as many of those acquisitions formerly coming from the Richard Baron Cohen collection. Another sister, a sister to Napoleon, older sister to the eldest sister Napoleon, Elisa Bonaparte, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, receives that day of January 1813 an interesting tea set decorated with representations of the Imperial Guard. And we have to remember that in January 1813 is like the first days following 1812 and the very dramatic moment for the empire, especially with the Russian campaign, which was very costly for the Grand Army. So we understand that a militaristic iconography following that year 1812, or actually produced during that year 1812 in prevision of January 1813, would make a lot of sense from a propagandistic point of view. Augusta Amalia, Vice Queen of Italy, so the spouse of Prince Eugène de Beauharnais, Viceroy of Italy, receives, as far as she's concerned, this wonderful set celebrating Napoleon and Marie-Louise's wedding in 1810 in a cameo-style decoration. Another celebration of the wedding with this vase decorated by egg vase, decorated by Couperin de la Couperie, sorry, that went to a lady in waiting, the Princess Aldobrandini. And finally, for 1814, in January 1814, so in a context that we understand is turning into a dramatic one, we're only 4 months from Napoleon's first abdication in April 1814. We know of a vase, originally of a pear, ornate with a portrait of Empress Marie-Louise's dressed in a hunting attire by Abraham Constantin, which was presented to Napoleon's sister-in-law, Catherine of Württemberg, the wife of his brother Jérôme, so the king and queen of Westphalia. And it's interesting because in January 1814, the couple, Jérôme and Catherine, had already been forced to leave Westphalia and were at that time living in Paris, went back to Paris and living at the French court as exiled king in Paris, waiting in fact for the imperial regime to collapse only a few months after. Kind of same thing for the soon to be deposed Queen of Naples, Caroline Murat Bonaparte, so another of Napoleon's sibling, who received that at that day this set decorated with landscape outskirts of Sèvres, nowadays conserved at the Fondation Napoleon in Paris. Elisa, again, so the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, received, as far as she was concerned, a set decorated with cameo-style portraits of ancient, it's called portraits of ancient legislators, a very interesting allegorical scene evoking the education of the King of Rome by goddess Minerva, his education as a future emperor and lawmaker, a future legislator himself. And we see in January 1814 all like the interest that is seen of, you know, the future emperor that the King of Rome would have been if Napoleon had not abdicated in 1814 and then 1815, the future emperor that the King of Rome would have become. Wonderful tea set, again conserved in Stockholm at the National Museum. Augusta Amalia, again, Vice Queen of Italy for only a very short remaining number of weeks or months, got another tea set, decorated with games of cupids and nymphs, painted by Leguet and Sanson, now conserved at the Met in New York. And I will end with this one, I think also one of my favorite pieces of Sèvres of this period, a set which was presented to the head of the King of Rome's household, wife of the Grand Chamberlain, the Countess of Montesquieu, a set absolutely wonderful, imitating Florentine mosaics and hardstone trompe-l'œil, conserved at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. An extraordinary set, which I think, and I hope you remember, was recently published by Xenia Malmer in the French Porcelain Society newsletter last summer. And Xenia was able to actually correct a misidentification of this set, which was for a long time believed to be of 1812 and a present of New Year's Day of 1813 to another of Napoleon's sister, Pauline Borghese Bonaparte. And we know now, thanks to Xenia, that it was, in fact, one made for 1814 for the Comtesse of Montesquieu, and as a matter of fact, one of the last New Year's presents made for under the supervision of the Napoleon's imperial household. And since the time is running, I will conclude on that one, which I hope you will agree with me, consider as an extremely beautiful set. Thank you very much.
Sylvain, thank you so much for just an incredible presentation, so much information, and really wonderful to see how their gift giving did develop over those years. And I have to say, the final images that you're showing, absolutely wonderful. The shells on that are stunning. And a wonderful shout out, of course, to the newsletter put together so well by the committee led by Felix on the newsletter, and also to Xenia, who is one of our emerging scholars for the European Ceramics Group. So absolutely perfect end to a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Sylvain, if I could just ask you to move to the next slide, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we'll head to question and answers. So if anyone would like to ask anything in the Q&A, please do make a note in the chat box. We've got our final living room lecture before the end of the year, taking place on Sunday, the 13th of December at the usual time of 6 p.m. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome David Wheeler, who many of our society, of course, will know. He'll be speaking to us about this amazing sunflower clock and his research and the restoration process that it underwent, part of the Royal Collection owned by the Queen, of course, here in London. So do stay tuned for that and come back and join us in a couple of weeks. But Sylvain, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. We've got some amazing comments on the chat. Everyone's absolutely in awe of the images. I think especially against the black background, the early 19th Sèvres just pops, the gold pops.
I'm a fan of black background PowerPoint, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely spectacular.
Building.
Of course, of course. A couple of questions coming through. Let me have a look. Just so many people saying thank you so much. We've got a question coming through from Philip Anazovich, who asks, what about Empress Josephine or Empress Marie-Louise? Were they also making gifts? Were they diplomatic or not, or were they slightly different?
Absolutely, yeah. It's and that the interesting aspect is really to when when you look at things made under Napoleon's reign, the role of the household was absolutely predominant. So nothing is done under a member of the imperial family that is not actually managed and fashioned and decided and discussed and managed by the imperial household. And as a matter of fact, not a lot of things were done without Napoleon approving himself. So even when things were officially presented, gifted by the Empress, whether it's Josephine or Marie-Louise, you can always figure that in fact, it involves such a big group of people just managing things. Kind of, I guess, the way it would work nowadays in any kind of royal household or even republic political, political institution. It's interesting, for instance, and the kind of the presence of the new year, for instance, is particularly interesting on that regard, because it was clear, and it's clearly stated in the documents, in the archives, that those gifts are made by the Empress. When you officially made by the Empress, which explains why mostly women, except for the Grand Chamberlain, mostly women would receive gifts, whether they're ladies in waitings, whether they're members of the imperial family, or whether they're wives of important courtiers. But everything would be decided by Napoleon in the end. So the role of the Empress, and it's, it's generally the case with everything that concerns the imperial court, is actually very ceremonial and not involving a lot of personal implication, if not symbolical.
Yeah, of course, wonderful, thank you. And as you say, very important to remember how the hierarchies worked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Of the ceremonial, absolutely. A couple more questions coming through. Anne Anderson is asking about the green grounds that seem to dominate. Was that a particular choice, the ground colours that start to be used during this period, or are used quite frequently during this period?
Especially the vert de chrome. Yeah, the chrome green is something that I don't want to make any mistake, but I think it's something that's kind of developed, invented, and highly developed and invented under Brongniart's supervision, or just slightly before, but clearly promoted by Brongniart himself. And indeed, yeah, it's a color that was particularly in favor. There's always that question whether green was Napoleon's favorite color. I'm never sure if that's completely true, but it's definitely a color that we still today associate, le vert empire, that we associate with the period. But other colors were important. We can think about what would evolve into becoming the sang de bœuf, so the beef red, which also was favored at the time. But definitely, yeah, green color is a perfectly imperial color at the time.
Yes, a very rich imperial color, absolutely. Thank you. Couple more questions, but I'm just aware of time, so maybe we'll have one final question, which is asking about the role played by some of the oil paintings that you were showing, and the images. How were they then adapted onto the objects themselves? So was there a sort of transformation from the paintings and the fine art onto the porcelain at this time?
And that's a huge debate and subject when you consider early 19th century Sèvres and porcelain in general. It's that idea of the rivalry between the mastering of the oil painter painting a painting, and the mastery of the porcelain painter managing to copy the painting into something that was supposed to be absolutely inalterable, never changing. Unless you destroy it, of course, but like really unalterable. And that's a huge question in the sort of political and industrial promotion of porcelain. This idea that porcelain managed to create artworks that would be in fact more perfect than painting. What is fascinating, and I don't think we can really go into too much detail about that, but it's you have to think always with porcelain about the extreme complexity of painting with pigments, which in fact, are going to change color over the course of the different firings. So that requires an extraordinary mastery and knowledge of chemistry on the part of the artist, which is probably very different from just, the oil painter that just mixes its color and its pigment with oil. And on that regard, it's also a great subject to look at the mastery of painting on porcelain. Just an interesting case, for instance, an artist that I mentioned in some occasions, and which I particularly like, who's Martin Drolling, was an oil painter of the time, and because he was struggling to find monies and contracts, he worked for some time for the porcelain manufacturer of Sèvres and also Dillon Guérard. And it's interesting because there are some documents of his exchanges of letters with Brognard, where he expresses the struggle of moving from oil painting to being a porcelain painter. So it's something quite nicely documented.
That's wonderful.
And I think a subject, yeah.
And as you say, it's the chemical, their understanding of the chemistry is phenomenal. But of course, in the 19th century, you do get this exchange happening between the different artists and designers with these porcelain factories. So absolutely wonderful. As you say, I think a huge topic for another time. But Sylvain, it just leaves me to say, I'm echoing everyone on the chat. A phenomenal presentation. You covered so much. Thank you so very much for joining us today. And thank you, all of you. We had almost, I think, just over 200 people attending the lecture this evening. Please do think about joining the French Porcelain Society as a member if you're not one already, and join us next week for the FPS FHS collaboration, and the week after for our final living room lecture of 2020, which will be on the sunflower clock with David Wheeler. Thank you all so much. Stay safe, everyone, and good night.